Good afternoon. My name is Chris Paxson. I'm Dean of the Woodrow Wilson School, and I'd like to welcome all of you here. The topic this afternoon is leadership, and I have the pleasure of introducing two remarkable women, both of whom are leaders in their fields. I'll start with Linda Wertheimer, who all of you know as an amazing radio journalist. She is a Wellesley graduate. She joined NPR in 1971, when it was first founded. In 1976, she was the first woman to anchor a presidential convention and then election night coverage, something that she did for many years after that. She was the first director of All Things Considered, a program that thrived under her leadership, and she became host of the program from 1989 to 2001. I have to interject one personal thing here, which was during much of that period, I lived 50 miles from campus, and I drove back and forth every day. And so I feel like I know you very well, and you kept me sane for many years. It was wonderful. She became NPR's first senior national correspondent in 2002. She's won numerous awards, and of particular relevance today, she received Wellesley's highest alumni award, the Distinguished Alumna Achievement Award in 1985. So the other person I'd like to introduce is our own Nannerl Keohane. She is the Laurance Rockefeller Distinguished Visiting Professor of Public Affairs. As many of you know, she is a prominent scholar of political philosophy, leadership, and feminist theory. She's written numerous books on these topics over the course of her career, which has taken her from Swarthmore College to the University of Pennsylvania to Stanford University. She was president of the American Political Science Association, and she served on numerous editorial boards. She's also been a leader in academic administration. She was president of Wellesley College from 1981 to 1993, when Linda received her award. And she was the first female to be president of Duke University from 1993 to 2004. And then she came to Princeton, fortunately for us. Her leadership continues. She's a member of the Harvard Corporation, and she chairs the board of the Duke Charitable Trust Foundation, and she currently teaches courses on leadership at Princeton. So today, Linda will interview Nan on the topic of leadership. This interview is inspired by Nan's recent book, Thinking About Leadership, which was published in 2010 by Princeton University Press. This is just a wonderful book. Yes, right here, I have one too.
Hey.
And it really is wonderful because it combines Nan's insights as a political philosopher. So it's very high-level book on leadership, but it blends that with her own direct experience as a leader. So I really appreciated reading it myself. And I'm sure people will enjoy hearing about the book over the next hour. So thank you very much. And please join me in welcoming.
Thank you. Thank you all very much, and thank you for coming on a cold and dreary day. It is an honor to be here for me. I'm thrilled to be at this great university and get a chance to talk to some of you, and I hope that we will have a period for questions, and I'll be very interested to hear what you all think is important. But I just want to say that I'm a great admirer of Nan's, and I have been for a long time. And because she has done, as many people who graduated when we did from the institution that we went to, she has moved into areas where she broke all kinds of ground. As a new, and certainly the president of Duke was one of the most amazing. But as you know, here at Princeton, there have been a lot of women women like Nan into leadership in academia, and that's a great thing. And I'm very interested in watching, of course, two Wellesley women moving into leadership, who have moved into leadership in politics, Mrs. Clinton and two secretaries of state have come out of that college. So, I think this has just been a great period for leadership of women leaders. And I have to say that when I picked up this book, Nan, I went to the chapter on gender and read that first. because I think that this is one of the most difficult things that we have, the experiences that we have all had, is trying to figure out what is the difference between the way women lead and the way men lead, and what is the, and where are we going with that? But I'd like to start by just asking you why you wrote this book. I mean, in all your experiences of being the first woman to do this and that, you didn't write about that. You wrote a book which is much less. It's not a memoir. It's not your experience, although you do mention every once in a while things that happened. But why did you write this book this way?
Well, it's a fun question to answer, and I will. I just wanted to start, though, by saying how marvelous it is for me also to be here and to look around and see students, colleague students, and also staff members of various parts of the university and friends from around Princeton. I'm really honored that all of you are here and delighted to be with several very strong women leaders, including Chris for introducing us and Linda for all that she has done. So why did I write this book? Well, it's not as though there's a great dearth of books on leadership. I mean, you can find books on leadership sort of falling off the shelves when you walk into the airport and you're bored and it's almost all you can do is, 7 Secrets to Success. That's not the kind of book I wanted to write. Or they're big tomes of theory of books that seem pretty dull and not particularly helpful. Or there are memoirs. People write books about their own experiences, but that really wasn't what I wanted to do. I'm not very good at memoirs. I don't have a very good memory, and I'm much more interested in the future. The book that I wanted to write, and the reason that I wanted to write it, has much to do with my dual background, which you heard of in Chris's generous introduction. I was trained as a political philosopher from the time I was a sophomore in college. That's what I knew I wanted to be. And therefore, I learned how to think, as political theorists do, about the kinds of analytical questions and critical issues that are our stock in trade. But I'm also a political scientist, meaning I'm very interested in power. I'm very interested in issues about how people govern and how it feels to be governed. So the main reason I wanted to write the book was to bring those two things together. In fact, even before I accepted the presidency of our alma mater, which I did only after a lot of soul searching because I hadn't set out to be a president, I did so partly because I was curious. I did it because I was fanatically dedicated to Wellesley, but I also did it because I was very curious about what it would feel like to have power. Here, as a political scientist, I'd always studied it from the outside. I wanted to know what it would feel like from the inside to be head of a major organization. So I, from the beginning, knew that someday I wanted to step back and bring those two types of experience together, theory and practice. And as you say, I do occasionally mention some of my own experiences with some anecdotes. I draw on examples of other types of leaders. And I really am trying to do, I guess, as I put it in chapter 1, provide an exploratory journey where the fact that I've been through the territory before may make me a better guide. And that's the way I see it.
And then there's you sort of lay it all out in the introduction about how you're going to go about it, and tell, and then there are only 6 chapters in this book. The one on gender is chapter 4. But it is, it's incredibly interesting to me, the notion of, I also thought the chapter on followers was great. And the notion, and how you figure out who is going to be a good leader. But one of the things that I thought was really, I've just never seen in a book like this before, and John Gardner is one of my husband's mentors, and so I've obviously read his books on leadership.
Which are great books. One of the ones, as the students will attest, some of the ones I admire most.
And quoted in your book. But you list, among your leaders, you list Elizabeth I, Eleanor Roosevelt, Maggie Thatcher, Hatshepsut. Wow. I mean, I've never seen that.
I wanted to be sure in giving examples of leadership that I did so with some specific attention to women leaders. The majority of my examples are male, but there's a good healthy inclusion of women leaders, and you've just mentioned several of them. Jane Addams as well comes in there. I focus particularly on Elizabeth I and Margaret Thatcher because I find their careers especially thought-provoking in terms of how they dealt with the challenges of being a female leader at a time when they themselves thought of their own personalities as being very masculine in some ways. But they were also aware that everybody else was seeing them as a woman, and how they combined those different perspectives, that doubled vision. I think Margaret Thatcher was very clear that she didn't want to be seen as a woman leader. She thought of herself as the best man in her cabinet, as Golda Meir had done, and was a very tough, difficult person to work for. But she also occasionally played on her femininity. It was interesting to me to think about how that comes through. But mainly, I just want to make sure that people recognize that women can be very strong, very successful leaders and combat the stereotypes. For example, Sidney Hook writes a book about the hero in history. And once he sort of stops and thinks and says, well, wait, could there be any women who are great leaders in history? And he canvasses a bunch of people, Cleopatra, Theodosia, whatever. But he decides that only Catherine the Great, of all the women who have ever been leaders visibly, deserves to be called a hero in history, a major event-shaping leader. Only one woman. It never occurred to him that it seemed weird that there could be a woman, but only one. And I just thought that was not acceptable. Hatshepsut, you mentioned, I'll just say a word because this may not be a household word. Hatshepsut is a pharaoh of Egypt who is much less well known than Cleopatra, but equally fascinating in different ways. She was a very successful pharaoh in shaping the artistic, architectural, and cultural life of Egypt in the time that she ruled. She was Third Kingdom? I have to try to remember exactly when she ruled. But her temple in the Valley of the Kings is one of the most beautiful things in all of Egyptian art. And she kept Egypt at peace, internally and externally, and ruled very successfully for 20 years and organized this great expedition to a land which had always been fabled, from which many of their good things came. Bottom line, when she died, her jealous son-in-law, who was supposed to succeed her and had been waiting quite some time for her to move along, wiped her name off, her signatures, her little symbols, from everything he could find. Destroyed a number of her statues. So for a long time, people weren't really aware of what he had done. But she was a very successful pharaoh in her own right.
And what I always remember about her is that she strapped on a beard, tied it on with ribbons.
But then so did some of the men. They didn't all have beards.
To give, one of those, what do you, that
ceremonial beards.
That ceremonial looking, funny looking thing. But the thing that when I think about leadership right now, this week, in this world, it seems to me that we have some very interesting things going on that speak directly to leadership. And one is, of course, what is happening in the Middle East. What happened in Tahrir Square was just what you were writing about. It was a group of people that came together, seemed to agree, to disagree about a lot of things, but to agree on some shared goals and to try to figure out how to get to them, but without coalescing around a particular leader. When al-Baradei came back to Egypt, they didn't stream out to the airport and welcome him home. It seemed to be a leaderless but extraordinarily successful movement.
It's a fascinating question, exactly how leadership has or has not played out in the Egyptian revolution. And my answer to that would be a slightly different take. First of all, it becomes really interesting to look at these leaders like Mubarak, who had been in power for a very long time and seemed to have a sort of a lock on power in Egypt, if one looked superficially, who then all of a sudden turned out to be much more vulnerable than people could have expected. And one key element here, of course, is division within the leading class, which many social scientists or historians would have said, if you have a division in the ruling class, then it's going to be much easier to topple a powerful leader, compared, for example, with China, where at the time of Tiananmen Square, there wasn't that kind of wedge. But you've pointed to the even more interesting question, what was going on in Tahrir Square? And although I wasn't lucky enough to be there, we were there about 3 weeks before, but we had no conception that the place was coming to a boil. We were only American tourists on a National Geographic trip, but certainly we would not have been able to see, we saw it coming. No way. So we, however, knowing some of the Egyptians that we ran into, I find it fascinating to consider how they were organizing their lives there, how they were planning their strategies, how they were responding to the police thugs, to Mubarak's continually shifting pronouncements. I do not think it makes any sense to speak of it as a leaderless movement, because I don't think that collective human activities of any complexity can really be leaderless. I define leader in my book. A leader is someone who defines or clarifies goals for a set of individuals, a defined group of individuals, and mobilizes the energies of members of that group to pursue them. Now, sometimes the group can be as large as the United States or a huge corporation, but it can also mean smaller groups. And my claim would be that in Tahrir Square, there have to have been people on smaller levels organizing people to get jobs done, to bring in food, to figure out how you're going to respond to the next move by Mubarak. And they could have been doing it in relatively small groups. But I do not think it possible, and they would have been aided by information technology, which makes a big difference these days. But I do not think it would have been possible for all of them just sort of to sit there in their thousands and all suddenly have an idea at the same time and all sort of wander off and do it. That's not the way it works. Human beings in groups have leaders, small-scale leaders, ephemeral leaders, good leaders, bad leaders, but people who do define goals and mobilize energies. So I don't think it's leaderless, I think it's multiple leaders.
Clearly, that's what our reporters kept telling us, that there were people who were organizing food, there were people who were organizing medical care when people were dehydrated, they were provided with water. There were other people who were detailed just to keep the place tidy and keep it from getting to be a disgusting pile of garbage. And they worked they seemed to work very well together, despite the fact that under ordinary circumstances, there were a lot of people there who disagreed with each other.
This is true. But I guess one of the main points of your question, which I should be sure to move on to as well, is, so how out of that collection I've just described of multiple leaders moving in and out fluidly, how is it likely and in what ways that a single leader or set of leaders will emerge that can be elected to the head of a democratic government, which is a different kind of challenge.
And a much more serious, I think, and really hard to gauge kind of challenge. Now in Morocco, which was having huge demonstrations just over the weekend, Morocco is relatively prosperous, relatively peaceful, relatively okay with its king. He is, I think he's been there for 10 years or something. And they didn't have as many issues. And Tom Jelton, who was our reporter who went there, said, it's a little bit like the Democratic Convention, he said. He said, there are the women's rights people are over here, and there are the people who have religious concerns over here. People who are worried about jobs are over there. And he said it's, you can just, there are caucuses all over the place. And they, of course, I guess it was an entirely different, they just don't have as many issues with their government as Tunisia did and as Egypt does. But the idea that the information, in this information age, you could rally, that has to have been one of the ways it happened. Facebook, Twitter.
Right.
I mean, without that kind of information, that level of information and organizational capacity has generally been in the hands of leaders. But what does it mean if it's in everyone's hands?
If it's in everyone's hands, then it clearly ups the stakes of having people engaged and involved and informed and therefore having a kind of power. But I don't think that it undermines my crucial point here. Everybody can have their Facebook, their Twitter, their cell phones on, but unless somebody is suggesting that they do something through the Facebook or in person or whatever, they're just going to sort of read random messages and wander around. So it's a useful instrument, but it doesn't mean that you don't have leadership.
Does that remind you of college, reading random messages?
Reading random messages.
I'm somewhat more fascinated. I mean, it isn't such an existential issue, but by the Tea Party. I mean, I've been spending a lot of time. I spend a lot of time talking to people about what they think is important, and to voters, and to go watch elections and see what happens and so forth. And the Tea Party people that I have managed to find in groups are they are very proud of the fact that they do not have a candidate, they do not have a leader, they do want to have a candidate or a leader. They have ideas, and they want their ideas we want people to pay attention to their ideas, and they feel that if there's a person at the top of the pyramid, that they will lose that.
You know, funny thing is, this reminds me so much of a very different era and a very different place. It sounds to me like when I was a member of the radical feminist group in Stanford in the 1970s, the beginning of second wave feminism, when we all were just so exhilarated about having a leaderless movement. We were all going to make decisions together. We were all going to be equal. We were very dubious about leadership because that would mean somebody had more power than somebody else. And that was anathema. I had been prepared for that by being a professor at a Quaker college, Swarthmore College, where faculty meetings were run that way. And they took all day, right? So it just takes a very long time to have people say, we don't want leaders, we want to be equal. So in the radical feminist collective groups in the faculty at Stanford, we would sit on the carpet of somebody's living room late into the night, drinking red wine and eating peanuts and talking about what we were going to do. But it took forever to reach a decision. And so some of us just got kind of frustrated and said, we got to figure out some way, folks, to do something other than talk. And that's going to mean somebody has to say, what about this idea? Let's go and do it. Now, I would hope and assume that the same thing is happening in the Tea Party. That somebody's saying, okay, we have made our points. We are very much allergic to traditional leadership and to Washington. But if we're going to accomplish anything, we can't just sit around and each of us spout speeches. I would assume they're having the same experience.
Then it would be like the Congress.
You're right. You're in the right place. Right?
One of the things, though, that is so interesting about them is that they did get one. I mean, somebody did sort of lead them. I'm not sure how this happened. I've been taking credit for it myself because I make speeches about how if you don't like your Congress, then what you have to do is go after them and change them, get different ones. And they say, well, of course you can't do that because, everybody who runs always wins until they, members of Congress are semi-permanent. And so, but in fact, what you have to do is you have to go after them in primaries. That's the most vulnerable moment they have. And if you go after them in primaries in years where there is no presidential election, they're more vulnerable still. And that's what happened here. And somewhere, somewhere out of the cloud came the information that this would work. And so the Tea Party organized, and the Tea Party showed up, and the Tea Party changed the face of the Congress. And I mean, it's not at all clear that they can repeat it, can repeat that performance, but it was an extraordinary thing to have done. And I think that was a kind of strange leadership. But what it has produced with these Tea Party freshmen in the House of Representatives is it has produced another very odd form of leadership. These young people, they're not all young, these people are looking at cutting budgets in ways that for generations they have not been cut. And their leaders say to them, you can't do that. And they say, just hide and watch, Betty. I mean, we're watching a defiance of leadership.
Well, one of the things that I talk about in my book is the relationships or the connections between leaders and folks who are supposed to be their followers, and point out that although following sounds like it's something that you sort of dutifully do, you get in line, often, in fact, followers have their own ideas that may constrain the activities of the leaders, may influence them deeply. And in some cases, I talk about people called non-followers, who are in a position where they might seem to have an obligation to the leader, but really don't like the way the leader is going. I think of Dick Cheney as a non-follower of Barack Obama. I mean, he's a citizen of the country, but he is clearly not at all interested in going where Obama wants him to go.
He had some days when he wasn't going where George Bush wanted him to go.
This is also true. But it seems to me the Tea Party folks are non-followers in some ways, even of their own Republican leaders. And that is a phenomenon that we have to recognize. It's different from being a revolutionary or an active resistor, but it's very different also from saying, yes, sir, I hear what you're saying, I'll do it tomorrow. And that the phenomenon of non-following by followers is one I think it would be fun to explore further.
And it's got to be just a very different experience for those people who are trying to lead.
Of course, of course.
I think that the new Republicans in the House of Representatives, and that the kinds of things that they're doing on all sides are sort of, everyone is acknowledging that it's not going to work quite the way they want it to. But it may work somehow. And I suppose that's what you mean by they're constraining the activities of the people who normally ought to be able to lead them in a particular direction.
Right.
Also, one of the very interesting sections of the book has to do with the qualifications of leaders. And what do you need to be or to do to lead? My favorite part was the part about judgment.
That's a really good topic, and it's one that we could talk about all evening, but I promise I won't, because I will answer specifically what you said about judgment. But I see judgment, which I'll go on to define a little more fully in a moment, as the most important single characteristic that a leader can have. Two very thoughtful writers about leadership, Noel Tichy and Warren Bennis, in a recent book, said, judgment is the most important single quality a leader can have. With leadership, with judgment, if you have good judgment, very little else matters. If you don't, nothing else matters. In other words, you can only be a good leader if you have good judgment. Now, what do they mean? I think of judgment, which has been discussed in one language or another by political theorists from Aristotle right up to the present day through Hannah Arendt, but also by Kant and by social scientists, including our own Danny Kahneman. Social scientists talk about the differences between rational thought and intuitive thought, taking shortcuts. And after canvassing all of this briefly, I define judgment as a distinctive mental faculty or skill which involves reason, but also intuition and experience, that allows you to approach questions where decisions about human action need to be made. And it sometimes feels almost like intuition. It sometimes involves more calculation. But I think it's a very important facility or skill for leaders to be able to use in a number of ways, in appointing their lieutenants or their subordinates or their associates, knowing how to judge people and choose good folks to work with you, knowing how to set priorities. I mean, when you're a leader of a big organization, people flood your desks with things they think you have to deal with this afternoon. And you have to be able to say, wait a minute, I can't do this. So I need to be able to decide which are really the most important ones and the most urgent. Knowing when and how to make decisions. Decision making is a very important craft for a leader, but a lot of people fall on one side or the other of a kind of a balance beam. They either make decisions real quickly and get lots of things wrong because they've hurried too much, or more often they wait too long because they want more information to make sure they get it right. There'll always be more information, but sometimes you just have to move, or else the occasion gets out of hand and the decision is sort of made for you. So knowing how to make a good decision is also a matter of judgment. I mean, the list goes on and on. It's vision, it's what I call peripheral vision, being able to look around you, not just straight ahead. It's one of my favorite mentors, Terry Sanford, who was a wonderful governor of North Carolina and president of Duke, had an image that he used in one of his mentoring breakfasts for me, which was an extraordinary way to learn how to be a university president. He said, being university president is like watching a merry-go-round. It's like watching a carousel move around. And at first it all looks new. But after a while you say, no, wait a minute. I saw that red giraffe come around right after the horse. And then I saw those two horses right before the chariot. I've been here before, I've seen this. He said, the trick is twofold, I think. First of all, don't get so caught up in the routine that you fail to pay specific attention to things that may need your attention. But most important, look for the animal you've never seen before and pay attention to that one instead of getting bogged down, which I thought was really good advice. So, judgment. I mean, I've spent 5 minutes on that one quality, but I think it's very important. And one more point about it. We generally associate good judgment with good outcomes. And it's easy to say if you like the outcome that somebody must have used good judgment to get there. But there are people whose judgment we generally admire who can also make mistakes. We credit John F. Kennedy with excellent judgment in the Cuban Missile Crisis, when he and Khrushchev got us out of this situation by avoiding going in the most obvious first direction, which might have put the world into nuclear war. They used good judgment then. But on the other hand, just a few short months before, same man, John F. Kennedy, with a number of the same advisors, had gotten us into this horrible mess in the Bay of Pigs. Now, so was his judgment flawed? Did he learn more? Did he develop better judgment? Anyway, other qualities that are very helpful. Courage. Leaders do have often to deal with challenges that may require you being willing to stand up, take a stand, deal with obstacles, but also sometimes courage can involve taking a middle course when everybody around you wants you to go off in one direction or another. Abraham Lincoln was good at that, taking some compromises there. Leadership often depends on things you might not think about. Stamina. A lot of these jobs are really hard. Stamina, a sense of humor. If you don't have a sense of humor, I don't see how you'd ever get through life as a college or university president or a secretary of state or a dean. You got to have a sense of humor occasionally, although you can't always let it show in the wrong situation. You need to be sure to have, and this I'll wind up my answer here because I realize we're getting close to the point where we need to open this up. But my favorite source on this is an essay by Max Weber called Politics as a Vocation, in which he talks about what political leaders need to have in order to succeed. And he says political leaders need a feeling of responsibility, but they also need both passion and proportion. And it's the passion and proportion that I would push back on. And he says those two qualities are rarely found in the same person. A warm sense of commitment to a cause is very important to a leader, he said, because otherwise you will be cursed by, you will suffer from the curse of the creature's worthlessness. In other words, you'll get, your energies will be used in pursuit of something that's not worth your time. You need to be passionate about a worthy cause, but you also need to be able to step back from it and have enough detachment to assess what's really going on, and to have what he calls also distance from yourself. Not always being so puffed up with your own accomplishments that you fail to recognize when you yourself may need some course correction, and some distance from the people who are following you, which is in some of the ways the toughest of all, because one of the things we often hear is leaders are supposed to have empathy with their followers, which is true in the sense you've got to care about the people you're leading enough to work with and for them, or else you should go into some other line of work. But if you're only empathetic, then you can't, for example, point out their weaknesses, be willing to evaluate people toughly, and even perhaps in the end, fire them if they don't measure up. So you can't only be empathetic, you also have to be tough. It's a difficult combination, but I think Weber hit it right on the nail.
Well, now I'm going to go back to politics and just ask you about two recent, I mean, you talk about presidents and their leadership throughout the book. You especially talk about FDR and Lyndon Johnson,
right,
who had very different styles of leadership. But now we've just, the two most recent presidents, it seems to me, have very, very different styles of leadership and brought very different kind of levels of experience and judgment to the job. And I think one of the things that I think we are watching, particularly with Barack Obama now, is he appears to, I think his inexperience has been showing in a lot of situations, but what I really see about him is he confers, and he thinks, and he's incredibly thoughtful, and you think he's never going to get to the point where he does whatever it is he's going to do. On the other hand, George Bush went off on day one to do whatever it was he was going to do, and didn't bother a whole lot with consulting and conferring and thinking and whatever. He wanted to be instinctive. So two kinds of leaders.
Yes. Let me say how I would react to the way you've just described their situation, but also so that folks in the audience know, I also spend a good deal of time on Nelson Mandela and Abraham Lincoln, so there's a different set here that we haven't had a chance to talk about. And I don't talk specifically about Bush and Obama, but as you said, about FDR and LBJ. In terms of Bush and Obama, let me start with Obama. I know enough about what it feels like to be in a tough job like this, to take with some grain of salt the way the performance looks from the outside. You're a journalist, you're more attuned than I am to being able to pick up signals and say, here's some generalizations we can make about this leader. On the other hand, as a political scientist, I would say that Obama's gifts as a speaker, as a person who can articulate a vision at certain times in some of his powerful speeches on race, after Tucson, he really has shown the capacity to bring our country together. And I wish, in a sense, he would do it more often, but he has done it often enough that we can see that that is one of his strengths as a leader. I believe he's also willing to make decisions, but with a very hefty dose of compromise. And sometimes people don't like compromises because it seems that you have less backbone. My own experience, and many of the people that I most admire, are quite able and willing to make compromises. I think one of Woodrow Wilson's problems as a leader, if I may say this in these hallowed halls, was that he was very, very opposed to compromise. In fact, his family's motto as a good Presbyterian Calvinist family was, "God save us from compromise." And that's the way he behaved at Princeton after his first 2 years when he did all kinds of things. He would not compromise on the graduate college, and he lost. That's the way he behaved with the League of Nations after, strong years in his first term as president. So I think Wilson's inability to compromise brought him down. You might say that Obama is too willing to compromise, and that at some points it would be better if he had dug in his heels more often. I'd be willing to accept that. But I have the hope that he is working behind the scenes to accomplish some of the things that we believe are important for this nation, and will be able to bring it off. Frankly, if I were in his shoes, I would find the combination of the financial crisis, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, the explosions in the Middle East, you name it, unemployment. I mean, I can't think of any president in a long time who's had to deal with a set of issues like that. And knowing, how to set the priorities, how to use scarce resources. In terms of George Bush, George Bush certainly was a much more decisive person, in a visible way at least. He seems to have relied on his advisors, though, in a way that I don't have the impression that Obama is doing. Obama seems to be listening to a number of different people, whereas Bush apparently listened to a relatively small number of people. Obama's trying to get information from lots of different sources, whereas Bush was famous for not wanting to read the newspapers himself, but take whatever was given to him in the morning, which I think is a pretty dangerous way for a president to behave. Now, he made some good decisions, I think particularly in the second part of his time as president, but I would fault him for listening only to a small group of advisors. But I would hope that if Obama's listening to a number of advisors, he would be able more often, sooner, to take a deep breath and say, okay, folks, this is where we're going to go, and make a brilliant speech telling us why. I think that's what many of us wish Obama would do sooner and more often.
The president that you say came to office perhaps least prepared of the presidents you discussed was Lincoln.
That's right.
And who was just, a backwoods guy with no particular experience administering anything.
That's right.
And he, you say, grew.
He grew in office.
And that is one of that is an important characteristic for a leader, to be able to grow.
I think that's true, and it's interesting to think about other examples of people who have grown in power. Very few people do in the way that Lincoln did, being willing to admit mistakes, being clearer and clearer about what it was he wanted to accomplish, gaining experience and learning from his mistakes. I think he became a much stronger and better and deeper man in those years. And we got Fred Greenstein in the audience. He knows more about presidents than almost anybody else in the world. He can probably think of other examples, but I don't know many presidents who have grown that much in office.
Do you think, you mentioned in the section of the book on judgment, you mentioned that one of the ways that young leaders could learn to lead was to pay attention to those people who do seem to have judgment. Maybe even move in close to them, or go to work for them, or try to learn from them.
I think that's certainly true. I think you can learn a lot from observing people. Way back to Machiavelli, I think it becomes true that you will be a lot better off understanding power if you've been exposed to powerful people and watched them closely, and maybe even had some of your own, so that the combination of having some leadership experiences yourself from a very early age, because then you become more confident about it, watching, paying attention to people who are leading in ways that you regard as admirable, but also learning from the mistakes of those who aren't, and paying attention, as you say, is a good way. It's a good way to be prepared for leadership. But in terms of honing your judgment, I think you can do that. But there are also elements of judgment that people have from a very early age. One thing that I've often said, and then maybe we should move out to the audience, one thing I've often said is even young children, in my acquaintance at least, tend to differ in the quality of their judgment. I'm lucky enough to have quite a few grandchildren, and there are at least a couple of them whose judgment I think is exemplary and who I regard as likely to become strong leaders. I would follow them anywhere, even at age 7 or 10. But if they were helping us get out of a crisis, I would have a lot of faith that they could do it. But if two of my other grandchildren, whom I love dearly, but who sort of just wander around all the time, they have many gifts, including tremendous creativity, but I think they have terrible judgment from age. So I don't think it's just something that you learn. I think there are also elements of it that you're born with.
Well, I just have one more question, then that is, can you teach it? Can you train it into people?
I think you can hone it. I don't think you can. If you take somebody who's totally without any gifts of judgment, who really just makes silly decisions, I think it's going to be very hard to train that person. But if you take somebody who has at least a modicum of good judgment, certainly you can hone it through more experiences, through more opportunities, yes.
Okay, so you guys.
Yeah, good. So what we do, thank you very much. That was wonderful. Let's turn now to the Q&A. What we ask is for people who want to ask questions to come down to the microphones, and we ask that we like to let students take the first crack at questions. So if there are any, please come on down.
One there, in the usual way.
Yeah. Bill? Very good.
Hi, Professor. Thank you very much for your talk. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how we evaluate leaders and your thoughts on how effectively we do it. I was struck by what you said about how we tend to judge leadership based solely on outcomes. And I think in my experience, we not only judge leadership based on outcomes, but on initial outcomes, how well someone did on a first assignment. And then we tend to sort of track people into, well, that person's destined to be a great leader or that person isn't. So I'm wondering if you could share some thoughts on how we could do that more effectively.
It's a very good question. As with the example of John F. Kennedy, though, I think you can correct your impressions over time. You're right, Howard, the sort of Bayesian pathway of the first factors are more likely to influence you as a big one. In terms of evaluating leaders, frankly, I like the opportunities that are provided in some organizations short of the nation state, which I wish we had more of as citizens. The Industrial Areas Foundation, for example, has a great deal of emphasis on bringing their congressman or their mayor or whatever to address a town meeting with questions in advance. Do you support what we think is important? And they don't want long answers. They want yes or no with very brief explanations. They don't want speeches. And this accountability is the way in which those citizens are able to tell, not only does this person agree with me, how does this person think on her feet, and how much does she share my values? We don't have many opportunities to do that. We do sometimes through the kinds of interviews that a person like my colleague here might give, but too much of the ways in which we get evaluation opportunities are through sound bites. And sound bites are a really bad thing to evaluate people on. So having more opportunities really to hear people respond to questions, think through them, developing our attention span. I remember the reading and being amazed by the fact that in Abraham Lincoln's day, people would sit through 3-hour speeches. Sit quietly on the ground and listen to 3-hour speeches. You can evaluate somebody much more after that than you can after sound bites. So I'm giving you a meandering answer, but I think you're right that evaluation is important. Perhaps the short final bottom line on this is I think you need to look at how a president, for example, is assessed from a variety of sources and not just your favorite media. Look and see how some other media evaluate that person. Read a number of different assessments, watch him or her in a number of different situations, and hope that there will be some that go longer than just a few seconds. It's very important, yeah.
Hi, thank you very much. My question is, what do you think that leaders most often do that is wrong? And I guess most often, and then also, what are the worst mistakes that you think leaders make that we can avoid as future leaders?
Of course, part of the problem, another great question, part of the problem with answering it is that leaders are wrong in as many ways as they are right. But some tendencies or problems to which leaders seem to be subject to that should be avoided more generally. The first one that comes to mind for me is arrogance. It's very easy once you get to be a powerful leader and you have all kinds of people praising you and flattering you and telling you how wonderful you are and snapping your pictures and putting you on the cover of something. You begin to think, I'm pretty good after all, right? And you begin to believe your own publicity and to think of yourself as having so much skill and so much ability to affect the world that you forget that you are, after all, an ordinary human being and not that different from the little kid in the sandbox that you were 30 or 40 years ago. So arrogance is something that leaders often do wrong, and it leads them both to overestimate the likelihood that they will make good decisions and maybe take some shortcuts to get there. It leads them to underestimate the value of advice that others might give, and it leads them to overstate how long they ought to stay in power. Because if you think that you are really so much better at this leading biz than anybody else, then you'll think, I ought to stick around longer and longer, where, knowing when to leave is one of the most important skills a leader might have. So in a nutshell, I think arrogance is perhaps, and the behaviors that it leads to, one of the most important things that leaders do wrong. There are many others, we can come back to this, but I guess affiliated with it is failing to learn from your own mistakes because you don't really see them as mistakes because you're clouded by your own image of what a great job you're doing. Avoiding flattery. Machiavelli was really good on this. Everybody's going to flatter you. You have to find ways to protect yourself from that and get the truth without being so open to truth that you're sort of criticized from all sides with brickbats and can't get on with any of the work.
You quote Machiavelli in your book talking about how you cannot agree that you will hear anything from anybody at any time.
Right.
You can't just, have like a giant town meeting where everybody starts yelling at you.
Drinking from a fire hose, right.
But you have to have some people who will constantly be telling you the truth.
And people whom you respect around you and say, you will listen to their advice, but only when you ask them, and then ask them a lot. But unless those people are a varied group, you're going to get a monotonous background. Yeah. And it's hard for modern presidents to not listen to anybody else, but maybe a Renaissance prince could do so.
Popular conversation in political science, it seems, is the conversation between agency and circumstances. And we often wonder if someone like Abraham Lincoln would be a good leader in 21st century America. And just for the purpose of an interesting answer, I present that he couldn't be, in that someone like Abraham Lincoln, he's only suited for leadership where he was, and there is no universal leader for any age. Maybe you can comment on that.
This is a place where I would begin by quoting the author that both Linda and I admired, John Gardner, who said at one point, and I'll make sure I get this quote right, Bismarck could never have been elected mayor of 20th century Los Angeles. And then he said, Bismarck presumably would have been relieved to know that. And I would add, so would the people of Los Angeles, right? So whatever qualities made Bismarck a very successful leader in the Prussia of his day would never have worked in laid-back Los Angeles today. And that is very much circumstances. Now, the circumstances aren't always as glaringly different as that, but part of the problem is you're displacing from one era to another. And so you have to think also, are there personality characteristics that are more useful to leaders in some circumstances or sometimes than others? Another example that some people have given is LBJ and Ronald Reagan, who were leaders not that far apart, but who probably would not have succeeded if the one was in the other's place. I'm not sure that I understand exactly what that instance is supposed to tell us, but it's an example of the kind of thing you have in mind. Frankly, my own hunch would be, and then I'll I'll cut this off because a lot of other people want to talk, but my own hunch would be that there are a number of qualities or skills that are more transmissible or transferable than that makes it sound. Lincoln's gifts as a speaker, even though he wouldn't have been wanting to give 3-hour speeches today, could be very helpful in the modern world. His willingness to get lots of pieces of advice. You have to think of how Lincoln would have been if he'd been a 21st century man, and that in itself is a thought experiment that's hard to push. But I don't think that it's always the case that a certain kind of gifts are relevant in one decade and then never again.
Well, you know, the thing that I thought of the second you said that was that Lincoln is way too ugly to be in modern politics. Although his brevity, you know, the sort of those brilliant short speeches of his, like the second inaugural in the Gettysburg Address, would fit right into our kind of modern way of thinking. Probably somebody like Stephen Douglas was much better looking.
Problem is, a lot of people have talked about how important it is to be tall, and Lincoln was tall.
He was about 8
Stephen
feet
Douglas
tall.
was short. Right?
Wait, your turn.
Hi. I'm wondering, what are the biggest pieces of advice that you would give women leaders that might differ from the advice that you would give men? And do you think there are any different or additional qualities that women leaders need to be successful?
I hope you'll have a chance to read chapter 4. But short of that, first of all, as you implied, most of the advice I would give to women or men would be pretty similar. In terms of women specifically, there is a wonderful book that I would recommend by a psychologist called Alice Eagly, E-A-G-L-Y, and Linda Carley. And in a nutshell, they basically say women leaders who want to make it to the top, CEO, the Oval Office, whatever, have got to find their way through a labyrinth in ways that men do not. That the way for a man who wants to move to such a goal to take, even though he may face some pitfalls and some detours, doesn't have the particular challenges that women will face. This is her substitute for the leaky pipeline or the glass ceiling, which she thinks are no longer that relevant. But going through the labyrinth, recognizing the cul-de-sacs of having people react stereotypically to your work just because work by women is undervalued. Or having a boss who really doesn't know how to get along with a woman colleague. He knows he can invite a guy out for a beer and golf, but he doesn't know how to treat a girl. There are all kinds of obstacles that men just don't have to face. Most of all, perhaps, the ways in which women in our society and most societies are still expected to take by far the largest portion of responsibility for home and children. And given that, they're always going to find it harder to carve out time. They will have more conflictual priorities, and they will almost always feel guilty in ways that men will not. I mean, men increasingly, bless their hearts, are taking time to be with their families, which is great, but the expectations of society are, and many women are themselves both trained to be and feel internally that they want to be with their kids. So women leaders have to grapple with some challenges that men leaders do not. And thinking about how to do this, stereotypes, socioeconomic barriers, is the difference. And my advice, therefore, is to find yourself some good mentors and some supportive folks, both male and female, who are part of your cohort, who are moving through with you. If you're going to have a partner in a family, find somebody who really believes in your career and is an egalitarian at that. You know, if you fall in love with someone who really believes a woman's place is in the kitchen and you want to wind up in this White House, you got a problem. And I realize you can't prevent falling in love with someone, but you ought to be sort of thoughtful about it. So,
or at least realize it could change your life.
That's right. But I guess the last answer I would give to that is that women should recognize that they also have opportunities, because there are people who will regard the fact that they are doing something as heartening. It will be a model for other younger women, and this in itself is exhilarating. And guys don't always have a chance to do that. So there are different things you will have to face, but my main bottom piece of advice is go for it. Because if women who have the talents to lead are lost in that labyrinth, have no thread that helps them get out, the whole society suffers. They personally suffer because skills that they have, that you have, are not developed. And a lot of good leaderly capacity is lost.
Your good buddy, Mr. Hook, you
Mr.
quote him.
Hook, right.
You quote him in the book as saying that there've probably always been women like this around, but
they
they
didn't
just
make any difference.
But it didn't make a difference that they were there because they weren't in a position to lead, apart from the great Catherine. But I'd totally go with the, you see your shot, you take it. You just don't. You can spend your life thinking how terrible this is going to be for the kid who's about to go into the first grade, or your mother who's not been well for, and every once in a while you just have to gather yourself together and be brutal about it and go.
And we also have to recognize the value of the people who make the different choices and the ones who are doing volunteer activity in the schools. I had lunch today with some wonderful people who are making the schools much better for the kids and for the community and showing real leadership in this. And at least one of them is thinking about running for the Board of Education. And I would hope going on. So I don't want to make it sound as though the only way to lead is to head immediately for the Oval Office. The point is to show leadership and not feel that you yourself must always just sort of hang back. That's not a Princeton thing to do to begin with. And it shouldn't be a Princeton woman thing, even more than a man thing.
But you have to let the weight of your contribution, that has to be, you have to understand that that's a heavy weight, balanced even against your responsibilities.
Yeah.
Yes.
Good evening. Thank you for coming. I was hoping that you could tell a little bit, having come to those leadership positions after having been a theorist, and what it was that you learned in practical application that perhaps wasn't what you had thought as a theorist, or if you had gotten everything right and it worked out marvelously.
As a member of my MBA seminar, this young woman is giving me an interesting entry point here. As I mentioned to the members of the seminar, when I became president of Wellesley College, I had never had any major leadership post at all. I hadn't been a dean, I hadn't been a provost, I hadn't been a department chair. I'd been, a college government officer, but that was a long time before. So I was a dedicated faculty member who was called by my alma mater. And for whatever reason, I had had no experience. And so what did I do? I tried to read. I talked to everybody I could find, and I reread some of the great political theorists, including Machiavelli, who wasn't much use at that point. But I found that it was useful nonetheless to have the habit of approaching questions with some theoretical analysis and distance. That did serve me well sometimes, not to get totally bogged down in what was most immediately presented to me, or not get lost in details because I had been taught to find a way through to the most important questions. But in terms of what I learned about practice, I learned, drinking from a fire hose, I learned that it was very important to pay attention to all the people in a complex organization, and not to just assume that the folks who were most immediately in your view, whether it was the dean or your executive assistant or whatever, the head of the board of trustees, were the only ones who were important to the institution. So I immediately, partly out of curiosity, and partly because I sensed this principle, formed the habit of going and visiting people in their offices. I mean, I remember I went to meet with the folks in the mailroom and the folks in the machine shop. And they were amazed. They'd never seen a president. And I just wanted to know how they did their work and what made them proud of being at Wellesley. And when I would visit faculty members in their departments. So getting down into the trenches and finding out how people are doing their work and what it is that motivates them. You don't want to develop the habit of doing something that leads people to think they can make inruns around their own bosses and come and complain to you about something they don't like, but you also want to send a signal that you care about their work and you know that they are important to the organization, not just the folks who make the big salaries or the folks who give the big money, however important they may be. So learning practically in terms of the details of the organization was one thing, but I also learned that you cannot wait nearly as long to bring something to closure as you often could as a faculty member. You know, there are all kinds of ways in which you can just keep waiting until you get the good information. You got to finish deadlines, yes, but often they can be pushed out. Not students, of course, but faculty can be pushed out. But I learned you just can't do that as a leader. People are waiting for your decision. Lots of things are happening when you've done it. And if you wait too long, you may lose the time and the opportunity will be gone. So I learned the importance of the timeliness of decisions. And I learned finally, in terms of practicality, as you asked the question, I learned that there are some very rewarding things about being in a position where you really do need to deal with the nuts and bolts, where you have to think about things like budgets and leaky roofs, which stretch a totally different set of mental muscles and teach you some very useful things that I never learned through sitting in the library, and found it quite fascinating, at least sometimes.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. So Ben and then Professor Greenstein, did you have a question? Good.
Thank you for the wonderful talk so far. I'm curious that you mentioned one of the reasons you accepted the presidency of Wellesley was to experience what it would be like to be in a position of power, to hold power. And that I think many people view leaders as people who can consolidate power and centralize it. And thinking about what's going on in the Middle East and North Africa right now, thinking about the increased access to information technology, whether you think the ability to devolve power is an increasingly important characteristic for leaders.
I certainly think that the ability to delegate and devolve is an important characteristic that is often underestimated by people who are looking at national leadership. For the university or the college, it was very different. I mean, I would have been a fool to try to just overly centralize power without recognizing that the faculty, the deans, the student leaders, the alumni, all of the people who had a stake in the place needed to be part of the formulation of problems and the ultimate implementation of solutions. So that centralization, now granted, institutions differ by degree of centralization, and I'm now on the board of one, Harvard University, that's about the most decentralized place you can imagine, and I happen to believe that actually Harvard would be a little better off if we weren't quite so devolved. But on the other hand, you have to understand that the ability to make tight decisions and to move an institution forward without having to spend an enormous amount of time consulting over and over again can be very helpful. Let me give you just one anecdote from my own experience that I use in the book. When I was on the IBM board, I once, after we had appointed Lou Gerstner CEO, attended one of his first meetings where his way of fixing IBM, which was in great trouble at that time, was to begin to downsize and outsource. Those words are so familiar now. They were alien corn at that time. IBM had been known for job security, once an IBMer, always an IBMer. He was proposing to close the plant in Boca Raton, Florida, and lay the people off. And not only proposing, he had decided to do it. He wasn't telling us at the board that he was coming to ask us. He was telling he was going to do it. And all he wanted us to know was his arrangements for severance and for publicity for the decision. Well, at that point, there was a department at Duke that was really in trouble. I mean, it didn't have any students, nobody was doing any research, it was just sort of limping along. And the provost and the dean and I were trying to figure out what we were going to do with it. How do we reform it? How do we combine it? What do we do? I fantasized for a few minutes. What would happen if I went to the Duke board and said, Department X is in real trouble, I'm going to just close it down. And here's what's going to happen to the people, and here's how it's going to be publicized. There would have been a complete and appropriate outcry, because that's not the way you run a university. The faculty would have said, truly, you've completely trampled on our rights as part of this university's governing process. And I wasn't really interested in being tarred and feathered and ridden out of town, so I didn't do it. But I did realize how much easier, in a way, it is to make a decision in a highly centralized institution. You also lose some things, but it is a lot easier. I happen to like our system better, but it's different. Fred?
I have a question in the form of a footnote to that seminal Weber essay that you make such good use of. Weber also at one point says of the type of politician who is a problem solver, pragmatist, that figure needs to engage in the firm taming of the passions. Now, in modern psychobabble, that might be emotional intelligence. Think of whether Richard Nixon, at the time that he was overwhelmingly reelected for a second term, seemed to be an effective leader. Certainly, people who knew a lot about Nixon thought of him as someone who had exceptional judgment, and certainly at the level of political strategy, this was someone who had, one way or another, ended the American combat role in Vietnam, not the advisory role. He had gone to China, and he had gone to the Soviet Union, and in these cases, these were major breakthroughs, and 2 years before taking office, he had published an article in the Premier Foreign Affairs periodical saying that those were saying or implying that those things were needed, but at the same time, his Shakespearean paranoia had come into play, and the presidency only had a year or two to go. So this is your exam question. Discussing comment.
I hope I have a little bit of time before the deadline. I recognize that Nixon took some extraordinarily important and bold steps as president, which were beneficial to our country and the world. But I think that the downsides of his approach, the paranoia, the way in which he really did not reach out or trust, he was very bad at trusting people. I think that's a real weakness for a leader. And I think the fact that you didn't use the phrase Watergate, even though you implied it, means that there are ways in which his judgment was also tremendously flawed. And so maybe the best way to wind up this brief essay is we shouldn't think of judgment as a big single ball of sealing wax. That people can have good judgment in some types of problems and less good judgment in others. And it probably does have something to do with their personal characteristics.
So one more question, Emerita.
I'll keep it short. First of all, thank you. It's been a wonderful conversation. Nan, I wanted to ask, to what extent does your being conscious of being a role model influence the way you lead? And I'll give an example and another two examples. One, when I became dean, I used to say all the time at 6 o'clock, I'm going home to have dinner with my children. And I did that very deliberately. And 2 women came to see me shortly, about a month later, and said, you really got to stop doing that. You don't sound deanly. You don't sound like you have any gravitas because you keep talking about your kids. And for me, it was absolutely essential that a woman in power talk about her kids, because we'd be a better society if that were true. And I just have to say, it intersects exactly what Linda said. If that's right, that you should take your shot, then you're saying to women, forget the kids in first grade. Don't care for your family. Do what you got to do. And I'm not sure that's the right way you want to be a role model. So I'm interested in to what extent does knowing that you lead and that people are looking to you as a leader shape what you do?
Well, I must say I didn't spend an awful lot of time when I was president thinking about myself as a leader role model. I thought about myself as a leader and, sort of what am I doing, how am I doing. I didn't think of myself as a role model until it became clear that it was mattering to younger women. And they would tell me that. And then I stopped to think about it. And I became conscious of the different types of messages that should be sent. I certainly made it clear that I was casual, accessible, approachable. I don't know if that's a female thing, but I wanted women to know that this is something that they could take advantage of. And I made it quite, my kids would come to sports events, and they were around, they played on the campus. So I didn't try to either emphasize it or hide it. We certainly tried to make sure that there would be times each week when the family could have dinner together. But I wasn't in a position, as you would have been, where I could sort of announce it. There was nobody really around to announce it to. I just did it. But if anybody asked me, I would say, I try to protect time for my family, yes. But I guess the other side is also important. We had some years ago a program here for women who had stopped out to raise their children, Princeton alums, who were thinking about going back to work. And as you'll recall, Pathways to Public Service. And there were many good things about that program, but one thing I was struck by is that the women who came to the program almost all felt so committed to their time with their children that they didn't really want to give it up. They wanted, for whatever combination of joy or guilt or obligation, they wanted to keep on, and so they all wanted part-time jobs. And at that point, it wasn't easy to get a part-time job in government. So it was a kind of a catch-22 here. And one of the things I found myself saying extemporaneously at their final dinner was, it is admirable that you want to spend time with your children, and I honor you for that. But you have come to this workshop because you also recognize that you have gifts outside the home as well. And I hope you will also think of your own professional identity that you had. Every one of them had gone to graduate school. They were lawyers, doctors, MBAs by training. I hope you will also remember that that is important to yourself, to your family, to the society you live in, and to the world. So that finding some balance was what I was urging them to do. So I find often that's an important message to send. Yes, send the message that having kids is wonderful and we need to treasure and care for them. But being a professional woman who accomplishes things is also an important part of our identity. I was thinking about my office door, which some of you have seen, and I hadn't even been aware of it as a deliberate statement, but it now has on it the cover of the book and a calendar for some political theory activities through the University Center for Human Values, and my 8 grandchildren. Photos of each of them. Now that isn't intended to say, these are all important, but I hope that that's the message that it might convey to someone who has to wait outside the door for a few minutes. And I like that. So they're both important, but they are both important.
Well, thank both of you very much. Join me in